Well, hello there. Warmest greetings to you and welcome to this episode of Just a Few. My name is Patrick Antwine. Thank you for joining me on this platform. Here I have the opportunity to provide biblical responses to questions from people just like yourself who may just have an inquiry or something they may have read in the Bible that they just need clarification on. And if you have a question and you'd like for me to provide you with a response, please feel free to do so by sending in your question via email, preferably, to the email address on your screen now, and I'll try to provide you with a response as soon as I can. Today's question is another one that has to do with what some people may perceive initially to be a contradiction in the Bible, especially the gospel. Since there are 4 of them, you tend to find people look at certain things the way one writer presents something and the way another, and they find it doesn't line up. It's to them, it's a contradiction. Let me start off before I give the question by saying we need to understand that the ancient writers did not think and write like modern writers, so we can't hold them to the same standard of modern scientific critique and so on of their writings, because their culture did not have writings like the way we do. They did not write the same way we do. For instance, when we come across some sort of document, even if it's an account of a story of an event that took place, one of the first questions we tend to ask with our scientific mindset is it true? We want to know if it's factual. In ancient culture, it wasn't like that. They had another question they tend to ask for. So, for instance, when you read in Matthew 13 of Jesus giving the parable of what we call the sower and the seeds, or the seed and the soils, and could you imagine someone today picking up that document and that account and saying something like, what type of seed was it? Or did he really throw that seed? A person in that ancient culture would never ask such a question, because to them that doesn't matter. Their question would be, what's the point? And it'll be foolish for us to think, well, that person didn't write properly, and what you missed the point that Jesus made, because you're so thinking that it has to be factual, something that actually happened. The ancient peoples did not treat literature that way. They did not write that way. So again, when you read something in the Bible, we're not saying that we're going to see something blatantly wrong scientifically and say, well, that's just the way they said that the sun back then used to come up from the south, and we have to accept that. We know that's not true. But remember, they could tell a story that is totally, it never happened, but they could use it to make a point. And so their audience will not ask, is it true? They will ask, what's the point? And the point of Jesus' parable, of course, is there are different types of, the word of God is like seed. So I just wanted to let you know that very often what we consider contradiction could be explained in terms of understanding the ancient cultures and how they communicated and what was considered acceptable communication to them. To us, it might seem as if that doesn't make sense, but it did to them. So that having been said, I hope you spared me a few minutes there before I jump into my response in just a few minutes now. So here's today's question. The question basically is boiled down to it in this form. Are Levi and Matthew the same person in the Gospels? Are Levi and Matthew the same person? The question really was much broader than that, so let me read the question in another form. Is there a contradiction between what is recorded in Luke 5:27 and Mark chapter 2 verse 14 and what Matthew indicates in Matthew chapter 9 verse 9? Okay, so let's look at those verses of scripture and we'll see where the apparent contradiction comes from. Let's look first at Luke chapter 5 verse 27. This is really an account of when Jesus called a person to be one of his apostles. Luke 5:27. After these things, he, Jesus, went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." Mark's account in Mark chapter 2 verse 14 says it this way. And as he, Jesus, passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. So he arose and followed him. So the only difference there seems to be the name of the person's father, who might have been well known to Mark's audience. Mark includes Levi's father's name. Matthew now, in Matthew 9:29, says it this way: as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. So he arose and followed him. And when you read the accounts, you realize it's the same incident. Matthew, in writing, mentions the name of the person who was the tax collector to be Matthew, without saying, of course, that was me. That's the way they wrote. So it appears, same incident. One time the person is called Levi, the other time he's called Levi, the son of Alphaeus, and then now he's called Matthew. What's the guy's name? We need to understand something here. In ancient times, even before New Testament times, and it still is the case today, even in our Western cultures, as well as Eastern cultures, many individuals in ancient times had more than one name. And so in the Old Testament times, for instance, let me give you a few examples quickly. Abram was later called Abraham. Genesis 17:5 says, no longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. Same person. He was originally called Abram, but God changed his name, and we're not going to go into the meanings of the names. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, his name was later called Israel. In Genesis 32:28, it says, God said to him, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men. The name Israel has to do with being a prince, a wrestler, a warrior with God. And so his name, he had now two names. Judah's kings sometimes had more than one name. King Solomon, I think his name was Jedediah at birth, and then later on his name was called Solomon. But one of the descendants of Solomon, Azariah, 2 Kings 14:21 says, this king who died, his name was Amaziah, and he had a son who replaced him, and it gives us the name of the king here. And all the people of Judah took Azariah, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father, Amaziah. But when you get into Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 26:1, speaking of the same king, says, now all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father, Amaziah. Is there a contradiction? No. He had two names. The chronicler used Uzziah. The political history found in 2 Kings, they used the name Azariah, same person. Even in New Testament times, in the Greco-Roman world, many people had two names because of the convergence of the major cultures. So you had, for instance, Jewish people. They would normally have a Jewish name. And because the culture was predominantly Greek, some of them were also given a Greek name, which they use in trade and so on. But in the temple and synagogues, they would have their Jewish name. And then some of them also had a Roman name because the Roman culture had become dominant by that time. So, for instance, Matthew, his name, his Jewish name was Levi, but his Greek name is Matthew. It doesn't mean they mean the same, but sometimes he would use one, sometimes he would use the others. So that you need to understand that there is a reason for the two names. The person we know as the Apostle Paul, his Jewish name was Saul, but he preferred, because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, he preferred to use his Roman name, Paul, which his Roman plus even Greek, Paulos. He preferred to use that name in most cases. One last person, the person who wrote the second gospel, we know him as Mark, but he had two names. His Jewish name was John or Yohanan, so that they had multiple names. When we look at Acts chapter 15, verse 37, we see John was also called Mark. That's John Mark, we know him as. Even in our modern culture, I have two names beside my family name, and some people, they use both. Some people may use one most of the time. And another phenomenon we see in modern culture is, for instance, people whose names are William. like the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton. His name is really William Jefferson Clinton, but people whose names are William, they normally call them Bill. People whose names are Charles, some people call them Chuck. And some people whose names are Richard, they call them Dick. That's the way our culture is. Joe for Joseph, Johnny for Jonathan. We have that in our culture. It was no different in ancient culture that the people sometimes had multiple names or they had changed names. And there's a reason why some writers, depending on who they are writing to, may use one of the names and not the other. Matthew is the same person as Levi, the son of Alphaeus, and he is a guy who's generally accepted as the writer of the New Testament book called Matthew, the first book in the New Testament. Thank you for the observation and the question. Trust that my response helps you to understand how ancient cultures thought and how they corresponded with each other. My name is Patrick Antoine. Until the next time, grace and peace be multiplied.